Hello, my name is Rhiannon Brown, or Rhi, and I am a current member of the APUS chapter of Active Minds and former president of the chapter for a couple of years. And before that, I served as the media master for a couple of years. Mental health is very close and near and dear to my heart, as is suicide prevention awareness. Mostly because of how it has affected my life. I will say that it was a concern of mine before losing someone very close to me. And I want to just put that out there now, that it is important to care about things that are important before they concern you personally. But unfortunately, in this day and age, many of us can say that we know someone who either has directly been affected by death by suicide, or they know someone who has been affected. And so today what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about a wonderful man whose name was Lawrence Edward Allen, better known as Larry. To me, he was Grandpa. He was born in February of 1936 and died by suicide in August of 2003. But before I get to my loss, I want to tell you a little bit about him because I think that he's worth sharing. He was a wonderful man who grew up in hard times. One of the stories he always told me was he only got to go to school every so many days because he was one of 11 siblings. And a few of his older ones had died in wars before he was even born. And he had these big bumps, I remember, on the side of his feet. And he said it was from wearing shoes that were too small. So he didn't have an easy life growing up for sure. But I will tell you that by the time he married my grandmother and adopted my birth mom and her older sister, he was still pretty harsh. He was harsh from the life that he had lived. My mom would describe him as mean. I would describe him as a wonderful, wonderful grandfather. By the time he had divorced from my maternal grandmother and remarried the lady that I call my grandmother, she married into being a grandma because I was born in March and they got married later that year. I want to say in June of 1978. And I was his first grandchild, and I was the pride of his life, of his heart. Another thing I want to share about him is he drove an old VW Rabbit. I don't know if you've seen those. They're not very big cars. They're probably about the size of Mini Coopers, but they had diesel engines for some reason. So you could hear him coming 3 blocks away. And everybody knew he drove that car. My grandpa was the type of man who would get up and cut everybody on the streets in the cul-de-sac yard just because he wanted to serve his community. He was very good with his hands. He had a wood shop in the basement. It was very rare to have a basement in California, but my grandparents did. And I can tell you, when I would go to visit on the weekends, I would just sit and wait on Friday until he got off work. And that's when my weekend started, was when my grandpa got home. He would let me watch him work in the wood shop. He would let me help him garden. He just loved having me around just as much as I loved being around him. And I'll share with you some of my fond memories. We would listen to Patsy Cline together. I wasn't old enough to know who Patsy Cline was, but it didn't matter because he loved her. Therefore, I loved her. And another bonding point that we had that's unfortunately been kind of tainted now was he loved Bill Cosby. He loved his comedy because he was always talking about family. And he was one of the few people that could make my grandfather really belly laugh, like that laugh that comes from your toes. And so besides that bond with my grandfather and of course the Cosby Show, most of my life, I really loved Bill Cosby. Unfortunately, of course, some truth has come to light about his behavior that made him a criminal. And that has sadly tainted some of my good memories with my grandfather. So I share those happy memories with you because unfortunately, the rest of the story isn't as happy. My grandfather worked for the same company that will remain nameless for well over 30 years. And they decided to relocate to another state, and teleworking was not a thing in my grandfather's field. And my grandmother's daughter, my aunt, and her family lived in California. All of us lived in California, and my grandpa wasn't able to just pick up and move to, I think, Michigan. And so they laid him off. And this was a time when my grandfather was at that age where he wasn't quite old enough to retire, still young enough to work, but looked older than he was. And he could not find another job. My grandmother did not work, and my grandfather took pride in supporting my grandma. And I can tell you that age discrimination is real. My grandfather used to take shoe polish and put it in his hair to try to hide his gray. And everywhere he went, he was told he was overqualified for the entry jobs he was qualifying or applying for. And they didn't want to hire him for the managerial and executive positions because they said he was probably just going to retire soon, and it wasn't worth their time and investment in him. It's essentially the feedback that he got. And while that is unlawful under the EEOC, it still happened. And unfortunately, my grandfather was thrown into the pits of depression for not being able to provide for my grandma, not being able to pay the bills, not being able to be the man of the house that he was so accustomed to being. He turned to, he continued to cut yards for free and do all the things that he always did because he needed to do something with his time. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to fill it quite enough. And he just felt abandoned by his job, and he felt that he no longer held value. And he honestly felt that my grandmother would be better off without him, because if he weren't alive, she would get survivor benefits. Now you might ask, how would I know that? Well, I'll tell you the story of how I was thrust into the world of suicide prevention and awareness. Please forgive me if I get a little weepy, but that's vulnerability. This is life, and this is my grandpa. This is a true story. So I was only about 18 or excuse me. See, I was about 23, 24, somewhere in there. And my grandpa calls me one day, and I knew he had been depressed, right? I would go over, have him change my oil. He was an acts of service guy. And he was like, don't go to those dealerships. They're going to screw you over. Come over here. But it really was is he wanted to spend time with me because I was in college full time. I was newly married at the time, and I just didn't get to see him as often. And so one day when he was changing my oil, he was telling me how he felt that grandma would be better off with survivor benefits than the burden that he was. And of course I was like, Grandpa, don't be ridiculous. The world would suck without you, and grandma would be lost without you, as would I, with him being the only man I've ever had in my life. Certainly the only one who I felt loved me. And I could tell that he was humoring me by listening to me, but I didn't really feel that I had gotten through. I felt like he truly believed in his heart she would be better without him. And so I remember that conversation very well, because one thing you should know about my grandpa is if you ever spoke to him on the phone, he would never, ever, ever say goodbye. It was always a thing. You know how when you're wrapping up a phone call and you say, okay, well, I'll talk to you later. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Okay, love you, bye. He would just be like, all right, love you, click. And this is, of course, my whole life, I am older than cell phones. And so you would literally hear a dial tone and you would be like, did he just hang up on me? Like, I feel like he just hung up on me. because as far as he was concerned, the conversation was over. And so whether you were done or not, when he got done, he would say, well, all right, I love you. And he'd hang up. And it was always funny. If you had anything else to say, you'd have to call back. And when you did, he'd answer, hello. Like he didn't just hang up on you. It was the funniest thing. So after that day, when we had that conversation, I told him that my world would be shattered without him. And he proceeded to tell me, well, I'm getting older and I'm not going to be here forever. And I said, I know, but you need to be here till God sees it's time for you to go home. He had survived 2 heart attacks by that time. He was healthy. Unfortunately, he had started drinking a little to try to dull the pain that he felt in the depression. But that's why he tried to fill his days with being busy. So about a week after that conversation, I'll never forget, because he called me, and I don't remember where I was driving, but he called me and he said, Rhiannon, I just wanted to tell you that I loved you. And my grandpa never, ever, ever called just to say I love you. He said it often, but if he called, it was for a reason. And I said, I love you too, Grandpa. I was trying to come see you this weekend. And he said, I just wanted to tell you that I love you. And I know that you're going to be okay. And I remember thinking, yeah, I know, I'm doing okay, And he asked me, he said, do you think you're going to have kids anytime soon? And I was newly married, but hadn't planned on having any kids yet. And I was like, I'm not sure, Grandpa. I'm sorry. I was like, you want a grandbaby, a great grandbaby, don't you? And he was like, yeah, I need something to live for, Ree. And I was like, Grandpa, stop talking like that. You know how you don't think people mean anything by it. And he said, okay, well, I was just checking. And he said, well, I want you to know I love you. And then he said, okay, well, goodbye. And I remember being so shocked that he said goodbye that my heart immediately dropped. I knew something was wrong because he had never said goodbye to me one time in my life. I was so startled that I pulled over. And I pulled over and I had like a moment. And then I called back and no one answered. And I immediately rerouted, heading towards the house, to my grandpa's house. I don't remember where I was going, but I can clear as day see the route that I turned. And I kept calling. And finally my grandma answers, and she's all, out of breath because she had just walked in the house. And I said, Grandma, go check on Grandpa right now. Something's wrong. She was like, what do you mean? I just got home. And I said, I don't know, but he's not okay. Please find him and check on him. And I said, please find him. Hang up from me right now and call 911 if he's not okay. And so by the time I got to the house, she had called 911. My grandfather had swallowed all of his medication and was lying in the bed waiting to die. Of course, my grandma was traumatized by that. I was traumatized by that. By the time I got to the house, the ambulance was there. They had to pump his stomach. They took him to the hospital, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I felt like I had definitely helped save his life. I at least helped warn my grandma that she didn't walk in to find him dead. I'm thankful she was already on her way home, because I don't know if I would have gotten there in time. And so I immediately started trying to learn about the signs. Symptoms are what the people feel that have the thoughts of suicide, but the signs are the things that they show you, right? The things they say. And I immediately was like, oh man, my grandpa's really not, I knew he wasn't okay, but I didn't know he was that not okay. And so I spent probably the next month just learning all I could, spending as much time with my grandpa as I could. And he was just always very dour, and he believed in his heart grandma would be better off without him, no matter what any of us said. And Unfortunately, he tried again about a month later, and he did the same thing. He called me and he said, Rhiannon, I just want to say I love you before I go. And I said, Grandpa, please don't do this. I said, I love you. Please don't try this again. Like, we need you here. I need you here. Grandma needs you here. And he said, well, Grandma's away and I'm a burden to her. I don't need to be here anymore. And I just pled with him, please don't do this, Grandpa. I love you. And all he said was, I just wanted to tell you I love you before I left. And then he said, goodbye. And he hung up. And it was like deja vu. This time I called the police, 911. I don't remember where I was. All I remember is I was driving. All my memory of that day is now gone after that phone call. I couldn't tell you where I was. I don't know if I blocked it out from the trauma, but I will tell you that he succeeded. They were unable to save him, and he died by suicide that day. I was the last person he spoke with, and I lived with the burden of feeling like I failed to save him for years. So my survival as a survivor of suicide loss was pretty tough because I had saved him the first time and failed the second time. And I know those words aren't really true. I intervened the first time and I attempted the same thing the second time. It's just that the ambulance didn't get there fast enough. The second time, he went to the measures of barricading the door so that emergency services couldn't get to him in time. He was doing it for my grandma. That was what he felt. And so I went through years trying to find counseling support for survivors. And there was all kinds of support for my grandma. But I think people don't understand the depths of support needed by anyone close to someone who dies by suicide. And so the reason why I put so much effort into learning about the signs was to try to feel like, I don't know if I needed to redeem myself for feeling like I failed my grandpa. For a long time, I felt like I didn't love him enough. And all these things that we as survivors do, right? Because we try to attach ourselves when we don't truly know the pain that the people who have thoughts of suicide are feeling. And I'm sorry, I have a lot of tears. But what my grandpa did was, although he went on, some people say, oh, well, he's with the Lord, which is a nice thing to say. Unfortunately, I don't know what my grandpa believed. I believe that he was good enough to get to heaven. I will say that regardless of what people say, it doesn't really change how you feel. So as a survivor of losing my grandfather that way, and the way it affected me personally for years, I lived with guilt. And I'm here to say that if you can identify in any way with my story, you need to know that it is not your fault. If you have intervened in suicide attempts before, or you have had a discussion with someone who may have had thoughts of suicide, or you have done your part in mental health first aid and asked someone directly, do you have a plan, or are you having thoughts of suicide? That is what we can do. Excuse me. Had I been there, he wouldn't have done it. There was no way to stop him. And it took me so long to accept that it wasn't my fault. And I want to tell you, if you are ever in that place, know that it is not your fault. All we can do is what we can do. So what can we do? Look for the signs that people have. Not all people who have thoughts of suicide have a plan, and not all people who have a plan express it. But if they do, intervene if you can. If people, mention suicide or talk about suicide, stop them, look them in the eye, and have that conversation with them. Let them know that you care. Do what you can. Call 911 if you feel they're in imminent danger. There's the new 988 number, which that is such an amazing thing, because it is an emergency. It is a crisis. And I don't know if my grandfather would have ever called, a 988 in time of crisis. He was pretty prideful and pretty old school. But he might have, I don't know. But as the person that he looked to for strength, I did my best, to encourage him that we needed him here. And I do believe if I had known then what I know now, I would have been able to intervene, at least in different ways, and get him to resources and do all that I could to show him that he wasn't alone and that he wasn't worthless and that we were not better off without him. My grandma would have rather had him than had her bills paid, but he couldn't see that. And so I share this story with you today in hopes that if you were or have ever felt the way that I felt when it came to my grandfather's decision to take those pills, be it the first time or the second time, I'm just here to remind you that you also matter and we need you here. And all you can do is your best, right? I certainly never ignored any signs. I just was not as educated then as I am now on what those signs look like. And they're different for everyone, like I said. So I'll leave you with this. Survivorship is a real thing. It's not only spouses and children that need the support, it's grandchildren, it's friends, it's extended family. Everyone has a different relationship with everyone else. That's what makes us all so unique. There's only one of each of us. And we're all so important to somebody. You are the world to somebody. And I just want to leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Thank you for letting me honor my grandpa. And thank you for participating in the APUS Active Minds Suicide Prevention and Awareness Symposium. Have a good day.